thank you very much, Suzanne, for meeting with me this morning in Dublin and evening where you are. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and to allow our listeners some insights into your views on inclusive education and maybe the factors in your career that have shaped those views. Can I start by asking about how you got into this field, and maybe if you could describe to us your early career and what kind of sparked your interest?
Sure. Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for inviting me. I think, interestingly, I've been trained as a special education teacher, and I spent my first years of being a teacher in, special schools, and got to I guess see how that impacted on students and on their lives and how they were viewed and understood in the community. Because my first career was working in a small rural school where they built a special school, and then they went around in the small rural area and more or less recruited students to take to that school that previously had been, in their regular primary or secondary schools. So I got to see how those students were sort of seen, and understood quite differently, and how it really impacted on their behaviour and their, their sort of life trajectory, I guess, in their local community. I then worked in a few different places, including London. And then while I was actually in London, in Australia, in Queensland, which is where I've spent most of my teaching career, in a place called Cairns in North Queensland, which is near the Great Barrier Reef.
I've been.
Barrier Reef, yeah. Beautiful part of the world. Through Parent Advocacy in 1989, they closed the special school. And so when I returned to work in Australia, I was posted into Cairns and had the opportunity of working firstly in the secondary school and then in the primary school, the regular secondary school and primary school. And all of the students in that place called Cairns had been more or less enrolled in their local primary and secondary schools. And so we didn't even know what inclusion meant at that time.
Yep.
At that time, we're actually talking about integration.
So this is what, 89, is that what you said?
Yes. So, for people who are interested in looking at the history of, special education and how we've moved, sort of away from segregation, and then we moved to what we called integration, where we're trying to work out how to sort of fit students into a regular school. And, I very much experienced that. And we had to, prepare our students to join the mainstream, and, what did that mean? And we had to work with our teachers to think about, I guess, adjustments to curriculum and all that. So then as that happened, the school that I worked in particular, which was a primary school, just like looking back on it now, was such an inclusive school in many ways. The school principal was open and welcoming. Parent and community groups were very welcoming. Teachers worked together, in really collaborative ways. I was head of what was called a special education unit. We worked really to sort of support all kids to learn and be successful in that little school community. And so after that time, I actually started on my PhD, and I was really interested to explore what it meant to have an inclusive school culture. And I was interested in whether the beliefs and the values that people had, and how that, I guess, led to them being open to change their practice. So I was interested in that link between beliefs, values, and practice, and then particularly how that influenced a school in terms of its culture. And so one of the first, I think, important pieces of work that I published was about having an inclusive school culture and what that meant.
Looks like. And can I ask, for those that mightn't be familiar with the term school culture, like, what does that mean?
So the school culture is really about, I guess, how the beliefs and the values that happen in a school, and how that impacts on, what happens, how people, how they behave, how they, think about the curriculum, how they think about, students and families, what their expectations are of in terms of, students' sense of belonging and their connectedness, how welcome people feel. So it's quite a term that's, often defined in different ways. And people sometimes talk about school climate, talk about culture, but it's not just about what happens in a classroom. It's about when you arrive at a school and you go up to the school reception, and it's about, whether you feel like you're welcome in that school. So it's really about how you feel. And it's about that sense of belonging and connectedness, I think, and how that then impacts on, the policy and the practice.
Yeah. And from what I'm hearing, that particular school, for the period of time that you were working in it, was ahead of its time. Would that be fair? Was that representative of what was going on? I'm thinking not. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. And so we were really moving away, at that time, even of, having these sort of very detailed IEPs, individual education programs, because we knew that our teachers in our school, that wasn't really a process of planning that was really working for them. We were really sort of, if we think about universal design for learning and making adjustments, we were sort of trying to do some of those things on the run, because the teachers were telling us, hey, we can't have, 25, 30 kids in our class and try and run, 10 different IEPs for all of these different students. They said, we need to find a different way of working. And so we did tend to really work that out together. And I think because it was a school in a smaller community, that had the support of parents. And I'm saying that not every teacher was on board with the whole approach, but we certainly started working with the teachers who were committed and who were interested. And it was all about supporting students in our local community, which is what inclusive education is. It's about, students coming to the school with their siblings, with their neighbours, and looking at what we needed to do to support them to be successful and to be connected to school.
Yeah. And how for the time, how different was that to the policy emphasis? And could you maybe describe a little as to how that's changed over the past number of years?
Well, there wasn't really a policy that, we were following. I think a lot of this work that really occurred at that time in that place was really driven by parents, by parent advocacy. And I always, when I stand up and talk about inclusive education, I always say that I learnt about being inclusive from the group of parents, that I was working in partnership with at that school, because what they did was they really gently, sometimes not so gently, but generally gently, gave me constructive feedback to help me unlearn my special education ways of thinking and special education ways, of doing. So they would constructively give me feedback about the language that I was using, to describe their children, to describe programs. And it was really challenging, at that time. And then, after I went and started doing a lot more reading and learning about, really understanding what inclusive education really was, it really helped me to really think and understand that disability was just one area of diversity. Yeah. I remember that, reading some of that really sort of groundbreaking work about challenging, our whole sort of assumptions and ways of thinking that were very special education focused, and finding that really challenging at the time. But really it was like light bulb moments sort of switching on for me, because it's really what was happening in that school.
And if we were to bring you up closer to your current research and your current work, do you think that collaboration between our thinking at, say, in academia, at policy, but also the practice on the ground, is that there?
I think there's, like, I know with our more recent inclusive education policies and a lot of the work that many of us are doing in that space, there's a strong focus and expectation of working, across the stakeholder, like we might call them stakeholders in a school community. So very much, listening to the voice of students, working in partnership with parents, valuing parents' perspective, working in, collaborative, democratic ways, having those dialogues, developing those shared sets of values, shared vision, I think is totally, part of that process. And I think I really learned how to be inclusive in many ways by working really closely with parents.
And like, this is a pretty big question, but what do you think are the key issues for both the stakeholders that you described? So let's talk about maybe the parents and maybe the teachers and school leaders. What are the key issues now in terms of that special inclusive education conversation?
So one of the first things I talk about is, I think it's really important that people understand the difference between special education and inclusive education, because I think many people use the terms interchangeably. Here in Australia, you sometimes see, for example, a position advertised in a university or a position in a school, and it might say lecturer in special education / inclusive education.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot, like they're the same thing. And so I spend quite a bit of time talking to people I work with in schools and ministries of education with my students here to talk about and understand, the models of disability, and the deficit medical model and the social model, and think about how that informs, what we're doing in terms of a special education way of working or an inclusive education working, and really sort of unpacking and really having a deep understanding of what a special education approach is and what an inclusive education approach is. So I think that's an important, part of the work. But I also think the work that school leaders do, or not just school leaders, but leaders in education. So, we can think about equity champions in schools, like teachers who are, champions of inclusive education and really sort of take on that role of equity champions. We can think about school leaders. We can talk about regional leaders, system leaders. So I think that area of leadership, and I've been really interested in reading, a lot of work more recently around transformative leadership, with that focus on equity and, having that critical perspective, challenging the status quo, thinking about power relationships, inequities, in everything that happens in education is really important work that I think really that's what's actually taking my attention at the moment.
Interesting. And can you talk a little bit more about that? I'd like to know more, like, are you doing some research on that? And do you have findings about that?
So don't really have findings yet. I'm working on, I've got a great project, I was just telling you, working with a group of school principals in a lovely part of the world in the Maldives. And so it's a short course, a 5-week short course, which is called Leadership for Equity and Inclusion. And so that's going well. We're just sort of over our halfway point there, and really taking quite a lot of the ideas around transformative leadership theory as the underlying framework, but bringing into that quite a lot of work around ethical leadership, so ethics of care, critique, ethic of justice, ethic of community. Weaving that into all of that work around working with parents and community as partners, valuing student voice. So trying to bring in, I guess, some new ideas, but also some of the ideas that I have done research about. So I've done a lot of research over the years using that great resource, the Index for Inclusion, which I've used a lot as a tool to support schools and stakeholders in schools to work together in inclusive ways as part of school review and development. So I find that really practical resource that's got a really strong values framework, which I think is really important. So I've been trying to combine that with this work around ethical leadership. So we had quite a large research project a number of years ago. It's with 6 schools where we were really looking at how school leaders work to promote equity in their schools with a focus on being ethical leaders. So we did research there. And now I'm really sort of drawing on Carolyn Shields' work around transformative leadership theory and really trying to think about that leadership work in a different way. So I've got the school leaders that we're working with in the Maldives. We've got about 30. So they're developing their own transformative leadership plan. Really documenting, how they're going to work in their school with equity champions, how they're going to develop their teams, getting to know themselves. So I think, it's really important. That's coming back to that interest that I have in beliefs and values and, having that inclusive mindset and how that impacts on behaviour and culture.
Yeah.
So, just trying to really sort of try out a few ideas, and then we're writing a research application at the moment to look at some sort of comparative work between Australia, Canada, and Britain to try some of those ideas in a bigger, more robust way.
Yeah, there does seem to be, well, certainly in Ireland, the leadership piece is gaining a little bit more. Well, in our research findings over the years, inclusion and the level of inclusion within a school often was dependent on the leadership kind of vision or even just having knowledge and awareness of the concept of inclusive education. So I think it will only grow. Do you see any differences between kind of national contexts, say, such as Australia and the Maldives, and perhaps even Australia, Canada and Britain, maybe less so?
Yes, well, it's interesting because I do work in quite a lot of countries that are supported, by different aid, funded by aid programs. And, countries like the Maldives are very interesting to work in because they don't have special schools. We don't have to dismantle that whole
existing kind of system. Yeah.
Yes, and so you're starting in a way, from a different starting point, which is very interesting. Not to say that there's not, issues around sort of deficit ways of thinking around perhaps people with disability or people from different, diverse backgrounds. It's not saying that doesn't exist. Yeah, but it's different to be working with a Ministry of Education that actually, doesn't have that organised sort of, system and approach of special education, which is a really big issue for us in Australia. Even though, we're signatory to CRPD and, there's a lot of our states and territories that if you look on our websites, they certainly promote an inclusive policy and inclusive ways of working. But when you start asking the questions about, so when are we going to really start progressing desegregation and diminishing a special education approach, that's a question that's not really has a good answer at the moment. Yeah,
we're in a similar position here, and we're watching you guys closely because we only we ratified in 2018, so this is new ground for us, but I suppose, and I'm sure you've heard this argument before, Suzanne, but as devil's advocate, what's your response to particularly parents and students who wish to retain the special school or a special class system, who feel that their child will fall through the cracks if they do enter a mainstream school that doesn't have the necessary structures maybe to support their child? What's your response to something like that?
Well, I think, we do have a growing body of international evidence that talks about the impact for a young person, for example, starting school and going through an inclusive education pathway in comparison to a segregated, special education pathway. So we certainly can talk, I think, in more, clear ways, robust evidence about, what international research is telling us. And I try and do that as much as I can. The issue that we still have is we still have, for example, in Australia, quite a significant amount of our education funding going into building special schools. And I can really understand parents thinking when they see a very beautiful school, with all of the, many very fancy resources, with, a teacher-student ratio, that's often a lot lower. And they can see a lot of, these sort of special programs. And while parents see that as an option, then I think that they're very caught up in that whole sort of, focus of, this is going to be the best education setting and place for my child, because they're concerned about what's happening in the regular schools with not having enough resources and enough support and teacher training to support their particular needs of their child. There's also issues, I think, everywhere about, whether looking at student safety and their well-being in terms of, social and emotional well-being, which I think are really significant issues. And I always say, if we're worried about any child in a school in terms of their social emotional well-being, then that's a problem. It doesn't matter, whether we're thinking about a child who has a disability or not. If that is a problem happening in any school, then that's a problem that needs to be addressed. So, we try and sort of think about the evidence. We work with quite a lot of parents here in Queensland, and once they find out that it's actually their child's right to attend their local school with their peers and with their friends in their local community, and it's their right, to access an education that's appropriate to meet their needs, and it's appropriate to get, resourcing and all of that type of, support that goes along with an inclusive setting, then parents often feel very empowered to advocate for that and work towards that. What happens here, and it may happen in other places, that parents can almost go down the special education pathway before they know that their child has the right to go to their local school and be supported in an inclusive setting. And so, we are really trying to work together, I think, with many of the parent community organisations to really help support people's understanding of what inclusive education is and their child's rights in terms of an opportunity to go to an inclusive setting, and talk about, inclusive education leads to a good life with more choices, and special education leads to more diminished choices and often more social isolation, for example, and less opportunity to engage in work and all those things that come out of the data. So, just try and talk about all of those things in many ways.
Yeah. Is there anything, I'm kind of finished with my questions, Suzanne, but is there anything that you'd like our listeners to hear about? Is there anything that you think I've left out of our conversation that you'd like to raise?
I guess it's one of the things that is is frustrating, because I think we've all been, a number of us have been in this area for a long time. I sort of wrote this chapter in a book a number of years ago about, going 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's really challenging. And I think there's a team of people that I'm working with here. We're really trying to draw on different experience from different countries, like the story in Italy with closing special schools, the Canadian story, New Brunswick story, drawing on a lot of their data and policy and reports and work that's happened there. So I think there's really there is a strong group of people who are really keen to work at diminishing segregated and special education schooling here in Australia. I know, as you said, that there's still, a strong group of people who are still advocating strongly for special education. So, I think that is something that, I'm continuing to work towards, and I hope that I can continue to make a difference in that space.
Absolutely. Is there anywhere that people can find out a little bit more about your work or the research projects that you're talking about, or any kind of publication you'd like to raise that you'd point our listeners to?
Well, because I'm an academic at QUT, we have a pretty solid staff profile site there with lists of publications and links to. So QUT has a good ePrint site which has all of the journal articles and book chapters and things like that all there. Yep. Many of them open access. So we're really keen, to promote all of that type of work. Yeah, excellent. I've just done a TED talk, TEDx for Youth talk, which is not published yet, but it will be very soon. So I've really taken that opportunity on that TED talk, TEDx, it's for youth, to really highlight the impact of what a special education experience can be like, and can what the impact in terms of life trajectory can have on young people, and really used it as an opportunity to focus on evidence for inclusive education and why we should all commit to being having a national or an international approach to inclusive education.
Excellent. I'll try and get that linked to this podcast as well, so people can go between the two. Suzanne, that was really interesting. I really enjoyed chatting with you, so thanks so much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.